Regardless of how you manage to find the malicious activity, be it through looking for the name, looking up different processes, looking up registry entries, looking up new files, or dealing with the indicator categories we just discussed in the last video, no matter how you do it, the process pretty much is the same from that point on. Once you find something that's interesting to look at, say for example, I'd like to investigate the gandcrab.exe here. I'm going to go in and find you select this storyline, click the ellipsis, say create new query from storyline. Generally, I like to get rid of the source process portion at the front of this to get the more generic storyline ID, so I find it in more places on the system. And then I'll run a query for that particular storyline. As is normal in this case, I'll have to pump up the max results to see as many of the processes as I can. And if I want to, I can change from priority fields to all fields if I really want to take a very close look at each of the fields that are available to me. As you can see, I've got 19,711 events related to this particular storyline, starting out with psexec.csv.exe and moving all the way down through all of the modules and, of course, all of the thousands of files that have been affected by this particular storyline. Now, in this case, if I wanted to view the processes, I can do that. Go to processes and I can click on the PSExec view here and say, right click on this and say go to process tree. And I could view the processes that are related to this piece of malware as well. The difference between the process view in deep visibility and the process view in the incident page is with the process view in deep visibility, we are able to look at the processes around and outside of just the actual attack itself. Notice, of course, that because the attack has already been identified as being malicious or suspicious, it is labeled in red. If, however, this was not the case, it would be labeled in just the normal gray color, as we'll see here in a moment. Missing data is just the fact that the records for PSExec view were not loaded as part of this storyline ID, which makes sense because I'm only looking at records regarding this particular storyline, so there's no other external information. Had I done a more broad search looking for other things regarding this particular thing, then I would have noticed that there had been more information. Also note that if this were something that were not already detected, I could right now begin the process of telling the system that this is malicious. So there's two things that you're going to want to do. Once you've identified something as being a malicious act, assuming, of course, pretend with me that it has not done it already, we can go in and begin to do actions on the storyline itself. So I come back to the grid. We've got the E54 storyline here. We know at this point that this is most likely a malicious storyline. If I check off any of the boxes, it doesn't matter how many of them I check off. I can check off one, I can check off multiples. But in the end, as long as I'm looking at this particular storyline ID, I can provide actions. So immediately, I could mark this as suspicious or mark this as a threat. Now, in this case, it's already been marked as a suspicious, as a threat. And so this is not a useful thing in this instance. However, if I had found this outside of the AI detection, then the first thing I could do is to mark it as one of these two. This is exactly the same as our AI coming in and saying, hey, I have found something. I'm going to mark this as either suspicious or malicious. Marking it as a threat is the same as saying it's malicious. Marking it as suspicious is suspicious. And depending on which one of these I choose, the appropriate policy will take effect. In other words, if I choose it to mark it as a threat, then it will automatically be told to the system, this is now a threat, and whatever policy I've got set for threat, which is usually kill and quarantine, will immediately take action, and every process that's in source process storyline ID E534 D5A, so on and so forth out to 41, will immediately be marked as malicious. And if there are any executable files, they will be automatically quarantined. All processes will be killed, and you have contained this issue already. You can also, just like we could before, choose to disconnect this system from the network. This may actually happen automatically if it's part of the policy. If the policy states to do that, it will be done. Or I can simply blacklist the executables here, and then they will become automatically considered malicious and across the entire network. Doing just the mark as threat or mark as suspicious, however, only marks this particular threat on this particular system. Remember, each storyline ID is generated when the system starts a particular process. That means that if I have run gancrab.exe on 10 different systems, or even on the same system 10 different times, each instance of gancrab will have its own unique storyline ID. So by marking this one as malicious does not mean I'm marking all of them as malicious, just this particular one. Now, if you remember going back all the way to the IR class, it is very easy to add things to the blacklist so that this would be marked as malicious across the board. And there's also a way of creating a star rule that would mark it as malicious across the board. We'll talk about that in the next section. But there are multiple ways that we could find individual or indicators of compromise within this storyline to find the same thing across our entire network. So marking it here as one time is not a bad thing. It stops it here, and that's good. After this, we'll have to find a way to detect it across the entire network because this number won't go across all of the stuff. But once you've done that, you've officially marked this as a malicious activity, and you have contained it to this system. Once you've contained it to the system, it will show up in the incidents page as an incident. And so now I will come down here, and you'll notice that we'll have the gancrab for the various systems. And this is, of course, the instance we studied earlier in the class dealing with the YWSRGO files. Now, once it's an incident, the only difference between the incident here and the incident that you have manually found will be initiated by, if you found it yourself, this would say agent, this would say manual. And that's the only difference. From this point on, your manual detection will act just like any detection we talked about earlier in the previous classes. I can now go through and mitigate this just like I would with any other malicious activity on my network. I can kill and quarantine. I can remediate and roll back. In this case, I can't do these two because this is a static hit, detection type static. However, if I chose the version that is not static, then just like everything else, I can do all of them. Now, commonly what you're going to come across is when you mark it as malicious, it will come back as a dynamic detection type, because remember, only those processes that have a storyline are only those processes that have actually run in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, there would be no storyline for you to mark as malicious. Even if there is simply a file that was written to the hard drive, some process wrote that file to the hard drive. So even if they should be static detections that needed to be added because the file is malicious, but for some reason the static information is not being added to the system or detected by the system, then you'll be able to come in and change that function. At this point, it runs just like anything else. I can come in here and I can mark each of these off. I can go to threat actions and I can go to mitigation action, and I can start by quarantining. Mark as, well, I'm not going to mark it as resolved, but I can add these files to the blacklist at, let's say, the account level, and then click on apply. And it'll go through and it'll do what it can to kill and quarantine all of these systems. Now, in this case, the systems are offline. And so what will happen is it'll sit there and these will be pending until those systems come back online, and they'll be immediately told to eradicate. The eradication portion of your remediation here can simply continue on into the remaining threat actions. In other words, I can go to mitigation action and I can remediate or roll back. Usually kill and quarantine will happen automatically the moment I mark something as malicious, but then I can come back in just like we could with all of the threats that we studied before. I can go all the way to roll back. I can mark these as resolved, set it as a true positive, and even add them. We've already added it to the blacklist, but we can do it again if we so desire. And I can even add a note. This was a malicious act we found. And click on apply. At this point, it'll go through and it will alleviate everything. It'll return all the files back to normal and roll back everything just like we had before. These systems are now ready to go back into production and continue their normal everyday use.